I'm having to do things with potatoes at the
What's
moment.
the mashed potato version? I've not heard of
that. He makes it in the film. The guy, he keeps seeing visions of the thing, and he makes it out of shaving foam, and then he makes it out of mashed potato, and then he makes it out of clay.
Because I have seen it like years and years ago, but I genuinely don't remember that bit.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Hey.
Hello.
Hey, Anders.
Hey, dudes. How are you going?
It's
Pretty good. How are you, honey?
You know, I am pleased that I don't have to work tomorrow.
Got the full 3 days.
I've taken Monday off, so I have.
4 days. Brilliant.
Nice.
Nice.
I've taken the next couple of Mondays off, so I've got several 4-day weeks in a row.
Oh,
good.
perfect.
At least done the same, so it's just like, yeah, that's definitely like welcome.
Yeah. Get some chilling down you.
Totally. I think I may go off down the town more tomorrow and wonder about it. So
Very nice. Are you
not
still?
much other green space to go for really around here.
Mm.
Are you still working for the dictionary, Anders?
Yeah, for now.
Why are you worried you're going to get furloughed or something?
No, they had promised me until recently that they would give me another 3-year contract, and then just like 2 days ago, I found out that that's been cut to 1 year because they're cancelling all new contracts because of this situation of the financial implications of what's just happening.
Jeez.
That's rough.
That.
Yeah, totally.
There's a lot of, you always used to say how like insecure it was in kind of academia. It just goes on, I guess.
Yeah, totally. And like, I don't know, like I came out of my PhD into the 2008 crisis. And then finally, when it felt like I had some security, this happens.
I'm really sorry, though.
But, you know, 4 days off and like some chilling to do and like just in general, like.
And lovely story time to keep you company.
And Ellie just made me a nice drink.
What is the drink tonight?
This tastes like a Manhattan. I'm gonna go with a Manhattan. I failed on my quest for some hanky panky action. Because Rehills didn't have any Bernie Branca.
Know that.
So I couldn't make a hanky panky.
Oh, well. Amazon?
Yeah, might look into whether that works out.
Duncan, I very much like your Strictly Come Dancing theme before you changed it. That was good.
Let's see what's Duncan's theme. Nice.
We're on Doctor Who now, but it was previously Strictly Come Dancing. There you go.
Oh wait, Doctor Who. I can totally do this one too. I've got one prepared for this.
Wait, hold on. Where
Matching your backgrounds.
from thematically speaking?
Well, I did have a story-based one before, but I have this one, and I feel like this is nicer and much more with the fitting with the Doctor Who thing. So.
Hey, the top of Gordon's head.
Oh, hello. I'm having to.
Dr. Gordon.
I'm having to do some cooking at the moment because I was delayed. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to cook while the story's going on because the story might get too exciting. So hopefully after the last chapter, like based on what we've seen, it's probably going to get a little bit calmer now, and
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
my thinking.
The dragon dying is calm.
I've arranged for it to be a very calm, chill chapter.
Good. Well done. Thank you.
So good. So good.
Anything for you guys.
I absolutely adore the way that you say calmer, Gordon. It's just, I want to like write a story that just has that word in it a lot and make you say it.
Oh no, now I'm going to listen to the way I say it. But I don't know. What do I say?
Listen to the way you say what, Gordon?
Well, I would say, you know those animals that have the humps, the camels? I think it was that. Was that the word? Camel? No? No? Close. I was thinking for getting washing, I would just use a flannel.
Mm. Mm. When you have
Anyway.
ice cream, do you prefer chocolate or caramel?
I love caramel. Oh my God. Everyone should get some chocolate and caramel. It'll be great. It makes us all calmer.
Yeah.
Oh.
Katie, I loved it when you went on green screen and your jumper became a tree. That was amazing.
I missed that. Again.
Pressure now.
Be a tree, Katie.
Be a tree. Be the tree we know you are.
Just not an evil tree.
Oh yeah, don't be one of these trees.
Yay.
Whoa, that is trippy.
It's ace. Love it.
Oh my gosh.
Magical blanket.
Oh my god.
It is faintly horrifying.
I love that. I'm gonna spotlight you.
I feel like if the world knew about this, green blankets would sell out.
My friend, the first time she went on Zoom, she had her baby on her knee wearing a green onesie. And she decided to put a background up of flames. So she basically set her baby on fire on screen. It was hilarious.
Did you see when the Queen wore a green dress and people put her in like Star Trek uniform and like a bunch of weird things?
Iron.
It was great.
It just goes to show how out of touch like the Queen's stylist is, because like any other stylist would know not to do that.
Michael, you've got a lot of green going on in your. Are you able to greenify yourself?
Oh, I've never tried it, to be honest. I don't really know what I'm doing. I haven't got Zoom Pro. Do I need to have the Pro version?
You just need to have a computer.
I think you can just do it however.
All right. I'll have a play later.
Yeah. And after that, if you want to try the Zoom stuff.
Colin's here. Hi, Colin. Hi, Andrada. Hey, Zach. Who else we got? Hi, Yvonne.
Hello.
Martin, Jonathan, creeping, but I know you're there. Hello, lovelies.
Kind of.
Jonathan, that beard. How do you have such good beard game? Everyone look at Jonathan's beard. Look at that. Is it real?
It just grows out of my face. I don't know.
Like,
it just grows automatically out of my face.
it looks like it's been, you know, expertly designed and applied by like a Hollywood makeup studio. Look at that!
Oh my god.
Look at that! Looking handsome, my dude.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I'm shy now. It made me embarrassed. So.
Oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry.
We'll quietly watch your beard. It's okay.
I appreciate it.
You look kind of okay, dude.
Yeah, it's fine, I guess. Whatever.
Yeah. Strong effort.
I'm assuming you've just got some green cardboard over your face and you're using a green screen.
Yeah. Yeah, called out. It can't be real. It's too good to be real.
Katie and Nick, can you get beards?
Right. It's oh, sorry. What were you going to say, my love?
No, I was just going to say Carmen's wall looks as if it would be very good for green screening as well, but it may not be because it's very blank.
Listen, we've spoken about this before. How about you and Carmen's wall get a room already?
I was going to say we should maybe move on from that quickly and get back to the story. So I'll stop and get back to my food now.
I am so psyched for this story. Like, oh my god.
Okay, so
expectations are here based on yesterday. I
think you're going to feel pretty good by the end of this. So I think we'll probably end up doing 2 chapters again. Like do you want me to stop at the end of the first chapter and see how we're doing for time, or do you want me to just kind of plow on?
Plow on.
Plow on? Okay, right. Well, I'll
unless you want to stop and hear us all beg.
I mean, no comment.
Frankie says you're not. Nick says you're not allowed to start until he's finished peeing.
You should have peed before story time.
Okay, so yeah, so I'll do 2 chapters. I think you're going to feel pretty good at the end of these. I felt pretty psyched at the end of these chapters. So I'll be interested to see how you do with it. Also, I bought a copy of Matilda today, which I think might be the next Storytime book after this. Just it'll be very short, it won't take long, and it'll be a nice like light palette cleanser after this.
It's quite heavy.
Is this the Roald Dahl Matilda? Okay.
Nick back?
Yep.
Right. We wouldn't start without you, my love. Right, let's get you all muted. And I remembered to unmute myself. Okay. Now, are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Chapter 6. I helped the dragon stagger down the hall the short distance to my small bedroom, the rope of silk dresses still dangling out the window. There was no hope of getting him down to his own room. He was dead weight even as I lowered him to the bed. He was still gripping his arm, holding back the corruption somehow, but the glow about his hand was growing ever fainter. I eased him back on the pillows and stood anxiously hovering over him a moment, waiting for him to say something, to tell me what to do, but he didn't speak. His eyes saw nothing, fixed on the ceiling. The small scratch had swollen up like the worst kind of spider bite. He was breathing in quick pants, and his forearm below where he gripped it was all that dreadful, sickly green, the same colour that had stained Yerzi's skin. The fingernails at the end of his hand were blackening. I ran down to the library, skidding down the steps badly enough to scrape my shin bloody. I didn't even feel it. The books stood in their neat, elegant rows, as always, placid and untroubled by my need. Some of them had become familiar to me by now, old enemies I would have called them, full of charms and incantations that would invariably go wrong inside my mouth, their very pages tingling unpleasantly when I touched the parchment. I went up the ladder and pulled them off the shelves anyway, opened them one after another, paging through lists, all for nothing. The distillation of essence of myrtle might be highly useful in all sorts of workings, but it wouldn't do me any good now, and it was enraging to spend even a moment looking at 6 recipes for forming a proper seal upon a potion bottle. But the uselessness of the effort slowed me long enough to let me think a little better. I realised I couldn't hope to find the answer in something this dreadful in the spell books he had tried to teach me from. As he told me himself repeatedly, they were full of cantrips and trivialities, things that any whittling wizard should have been able to master almost at once. I looked uncertainly at the lower shelves, where he kept the volumes he read himself and which he had stringently warned me away from. Some were bound in new, unbroken leather, tooled in gold. Some were old and nearly crumbling, some tall as the length of my arm, others small enough for the palm of my hand. I ran my hands over them and, on impulse, pulled out a smaller one that bristled with inserted sheets of paper. It had a worn, smooth cover and plain stamped letters. It was a journal, written in a tiny, crabbed hand, almost impossible to read at first, and full of abbreviations. The sheets were notes in the dragon's hand, one or more of them inserted between almost every leaf, where he had written out different ways to cast each spell, with explanations of what he was doing. That at least seemed more promising, as if his voice might speak to me from the paper. There were a dozen spells of healing and for cleansing wounds, of sickness and gangrene, not of enchanted corruption, but at least worth the trying. I read over one spell, which advised lancing the poisoned wound, packing it with rosemary and lemon peel, and doing something which the writer called putting breath on it. The dragon had written 4 crammed closed pages on the subject and drawn up lines in which he noted down nearly 5 dozen variations. This much rosemary, dry or fresh. That much lemon, with pith on or without. A steel knife, an iron one, this an incantation and another. He hadn't written down which of these attempts had worked better and which worse, but if he had gone to so much effort, it had to be good for something. All I needed right now was to do him enough good to let him speak even a handful of words to me, give me some direction. I flew down to the kitchens and found a great bundle of hanging rosemary and a lemon. I took a clean paring knife and some fresh lemons and hot water in a pot. Then I hesitated. My eye had fallen on the great cleaver lying on its chopping stone. If I couldn't do anything else, if I couldn't give him the strength to speak, I didn't know if I could do it, if I could cut off his arm. But I saw Jerzy on his bed, cackling and monstrous, far away from the quiet, sad man who had always nodded to me in the lane. I saw Kristina's hollowed-out face. I swallowed and picked up the cleaver. I honed both the knives, resolutely thinking of nothing, and then I carried my things upstairs. The window and door stood open, but even so the terrible stink of corruption had begun to gather in the small room. It turned my stomach with dread as much as physically. I didn't think I could bear to see the dragon corrupted, all his crisp edges rotted away, his sharp tongue reduced to howling and snarls. His breath was coming shorter, and his eyes were half closed. His face was terribly pale. I lay the linens under his arm and tied them on with some twine. I peeled off wide strips of the lemon skin, tore rosemary leaves off the stems, crushing them all and throwing them into the hot water so that the sweet, strong smell rose up and drove out the stink. Then I bit my lip and, steeling myself, slashed open the swollen wound with the paring knife. Green, tarry bile spurted out of it. I poured cup after cup of the hot water over the wound until it was clean. I caught fistfuls of the steeped herbs and lemon and packed them down tight. The dragon's note said nothing of what it meant to put breath on the wound, so I bent down and breathed out the incantations over it, trying one and then another, my voice breaking. They all felt wrong in my mouth, awkward and hard-edged, and nothing was happening. Wretched, I looked back at the crabbed original writing again. There was a line that said, Kai and Tihas, sung as seems good, will have a special virtue. The dragon's incantations all had variants of those syllables, but strung round with others, built up into long, elaborate phrases that tangled on my tongue. Instead, I bent down and sang Tihas, Tihas, Kai Tihas over and over, and found myself falling into the sound of the birthday song about living 100 years. That sounds absurd, but the rhythm of it was easy and familiar, comforting. I stopped having to think about the words. They filled my mouth and spilled over like water out of a cup. I forgot to remember Jerzy's mad laughter and the green vile cloud that had drowned the light inside him. There was only the easy movement of the song, the memory of faces gathered around a table laughing. And then, finally, the magic flowed, but not in the same way as when the dragon's spell lessons dragged it in a rush out of me. Instead, it seemed to me the sound of the chanting became a stream made to carry magic along, and I was standing by the water's edge with a pitcher that never ran dry, pouring a thin silver line into the rushing current. Under my hands, the sweet fragrance of rosemary and lemon was rising strong, overpowering the stench of corruption. More and more of the bile began to flow from the wound, until I would have worried, except that the dragon's arm kept looking better. The dreadful greenish cast was fading, the darkened and swollen veins shrinking back. I was running out of breath. But besides that, I felt somehow that I was finished, that my work was done. I brought my chanting to a simple close, going up and down a note. I had only really been humming anyway by the end. The shining glow where he held his arm at the elbow was growing stronger now, brighter, and abruptly thin lines of light shot away from his grip, running down his veins and spreading out through them like branches. The rot was disappearing. The flesh looked healthy, his skin restored to his usual unhealthy, sunless pallor, but nevertheless his own. I watched it, holding my breath, hardly daring to hope. And then his whole body shifted. He drew one longer, deeper breath, blinking at the ceiling with eyes that were aware again, and his fingers one after another let go their iron grip around his elbow. I could have sobbed with relief. Incredulous and hopeful, I looked up at his face, a smile working its way onto my mouth, and found him staring at me with an expression of astonished outrage. He struggled up from the pillows. He stripped his arm clean and then he spluttered at me, "You impossible, wretched, nonsensical contradiction. What on earth have you done now?" I sat back on my heels in some indignation. This, when I had not just saved his life, but everything he might be, and all the kingdom from whatever the wood might have made of him. What ought I to have done? I demanded. And how was I to know how to do it? Besides, it worked, didn't it? For some reason, this only made him nearly incoherent with fury, and he levered himself up from my cot, threw the book across the room, all the notes flying everywhere, and flung himself out into the hallway without another word. "You might thank me," I shouted after him, outraged myself, and his footsteps had vanished before I recalled that he had been wounded at all in saving my life, that he had surely pressed himself to terrible lengths to come to my aid at all. That thought only made me feel more sulky, of course. So too did the slogging work of cleaning my poor little room and changing my bed. The stains wouldn't come out, and everything smelt foul, though without the terrible wrongness. Finally, I decided for this I would use magic after all. I began to use one of the charms the dragon had taught me, but then instead I went and dug up the little journal from the corner. I was grateful to that little book and the past wizard or witch who had written it, even if the dragon wasn't to me, and I was happy to find near the beginning a charm for freshening a room. Tish-ta sung up and down with work to show the way. I warbled it half in my head while I turned out all the damp, stained ticking. The air grew cold and crisp around me, but without any unpleasant bite. By the time I had finished, the bedclothes were clean and bright as though they were newly washed, and my ticking smelt like it was fresh from a summer haystack. I assembled my bed again, and then I sat down upon it very heavily, almost surprised as the last dregs of desperation left me, and with them all my strength. I fell down on the bed and barely managed to drag my coverlet over me before I slept. I woke slowly, peacefully, serenely, with sunlight coming in the window over me, and only gradually became aware that the dragon was in my room. He was sitting by the window in the small work chair, glaring at me. I sat up and rubbed my eyes and glared back. He held up the tiny book in his hand. "What made you pick this up?" he demanded. "It was full of notes," I said. "I thought it must be important." "It is not important," he said, although for how angry he seemed over it, I didn't believe him. "It is useless. It has been useless for all 500 years since it was written, and a century of study has not made it anything other than useless." "Well, it wasn't useless today," I said, folding my arms across my chest. "How did you know how much rosemary to use?" he said. "How much lemon?" "You used all sorts of amounts in those tables," I said. "I supposed it didn't much matter." "The tables are failures, you blundering imbecile," he shouted. "None of them had the least effect, not in any part, not in any admixture, not with any incantation. What do you do?" I stared at him. "I used enough to make a nice smell, then steeped them to make them stronger. And I used the chant on the page." "There is no incantation here," he said. "Two trivial syllables with no power. When I sang it long enough, it made the magic flow," I said. "I sang it to many years," I added. He went even more red and indignant. He spent the next hour interrogating me as to every particular of how I had cast the spell, growing ever more upset. I could scarcely answer any of his questions. He wanted exact syllables and repetitions. He wanted to know how close I had been to his arm. He wanted the number of rosemary twigs and the number of peels. I did my best to tell him, but I felt even as I did so that it was all wrong. And finally I blurted out as he wrote angrily on his sheets, "But none of that matters at all." His head raised to stare balefully at me, but I said, incoherent yet convinced, "It's just a way to go. There isn't only one way to go." I waved at his notes. "You're trying to find a road where there isn't one. It's like gleaning in the woods," I said abruptly. "You have to pick your way through the thickets and the trees, and it's different every time." I finished triumphantly, pleased to have found an explanation which felt so satisfyingly clear. He only flung down his pen and slumped angrily back in his chair. "That's nonsense," he said, almost plaintively, and then stared down at his own arm with an air of frustration, as though he would rather have the corruption back instead of having to consider that he might be wrong. He glared at me when I said as much. I was beginning to be in something of a temper by then myself, thirsty and ravenously hungry, still wearing Christina's ragged homespun dress that hung off my shoulder and didn't keep me warm. Fed up, I stood, ignoring his expression, and announced, "I'm going down to the kitchen." "Fine," he snapped, and stormed off to his library, but he couldn't bear an unanswered question. Before my chicken soup had even finished cooking, he appeared at the kitchen table again, carrying a new volume of pale blue leather tooled in silver, large and elegant. He set it down on the table next to the chopping block and said firmly, "Of course, it's that you've an affinity for healing, and it led you to intuit the true spell, even though you can't remember the particulars accurately anymore. That would explain your general incompetence. Healing is a particularly distinct branch of the magical arts. I expect you will progress considerably better going forward once we devote our attention to the healing disciplines. We'll begin with Groshno's minor charms." He laid a hand on the tome. "Not until I've eaten lunch, we won't," I said, not pausing. I was chopping carrots. He muttered something under his breath about recalcitrant idiots. I ignored him. He was happy enough to sit down and to eat the soup when I gave him a bowl, with a thick slice of peasant bread that I'd made the day before yesterday, I realised. I had only been out of the tower for a day and a night. It seemed 1,000 years. "What happened with the chimera?" I asked around my spoon as we ate. "Vladimir's not a fool, thankfully," the dragon said, wiping his mouth with a conjured napkin. It took me a moment to realise that he was speaking of the Baron. "After he sent his messenger, he baited the thing close to the border by staking out calves and having his pikemen harry it from every other direction. He lost 10 of them, but he managed to get it not an hour's ride from the mountain pass. I was able to kill it quickly. It was only a small one, scarcely the size of a pony." He sounded strangely grim about it. "Surely that's good," I said. He looked at me in annoyance. "It was a trap," he bit out, as though that was obvious to any sensible person. "I was meant to be kept away until the corruption had overrun all of Vernick and worn down before I came." He looked down at his arm, opening and closing his fist. He'd changed his shirt for one of green wool, clasped with gold at the wrist. It covered his arm. I wondered if there were a scar beneath. "Then," I ventured, "I did well to go?" His expression was as sour as milk left out in midsummer. If anyone could say so when you've poured out 50 years' worth of my most valuable potions in less than a day, did it never occur to you that if they could be so easily spent, I would give 6 flasks to every village headman and save myself the trouble of ever setting foot in the valley? They can't be worth more than people's lives, I fired back. A life before you in the moment isn't worth 100 elsewhere 3 months from now, he said. Listen, you simpleton. I have 1 bottle of Fireheart in the refining now. I began it 6 years ago when the king could afford to give me the gold for it, and it will be finished in another 4. If we spend all my supply before then, do you suppose Rosia will generously refrain from firing our fields, knowing that we'll have starved and sued for peace before we can return the favour? And there are likewise costs for every other vial you spend. All the more because Rosia has 3 master wizards who can brew potions, to our 2. But we're not at war, I protested. We will be in the spring, he said, if they hear a song of Fireheart and stone skin and profligacy and think they might have gained a real advantage. He paused, and then he added heavily, or if they hear a song of a healer strong enough to purge corruption and think that soon the balance will tip in our favour instead when you are trained. I swallowed and looked down at my bowl of soup. It was unreal when he spoke of Rosia declaring war because of me, because of things I'd done and what they would imagine I might do. But I remembered again the terror I'd felt on seeing the beacons lit with him gone, knowing just how little I could do to help those I loved. I still wasn't at all sorry to have taken the potions, but I couldn't pretend any more that it mattered nothing whether I ever learned a single spell. Do you think I could help Yerzy once I've been trained? I asked him. Help a man already fully corrupted? The dragon scowled at me. But then he said, a grudging admission, you shouldn't have been able to help me. I picked up my bowl and drank the rest of the soup down, and then I put it aside and looked at him across the scarred and pitted kitchen table. All right, I said grimly. Let's get on with it. Unfortunately, the willingness to learn magic wasn't the same thing as being any good at it. Groshno's minor charms stymied me thoroughly, and the conjurations of Metrodora remained resolutely unconjured. After another 3 days of letting the dragon set me at healing spells, all of which felt as awkward and wrong as ever, I marched down to the library the next morning with a little worn journal in my hand and put it down on the table before him as he scowled. Why won't you teach me from this? I demanded. Because it's unteachable, he snapped. I've barely managed to codify the simplest cantrips into any usable form, and none of the higher workings. Whatever her notoriety, in practice it's worth almost nothing. What do you mean notoriety? I said, and then I looked down at the book. Who wrote this? He scowled at me. Yaga, he said, and for a moment I stood cold and still. Old Yaga had died a long time ago, but there weren't very many songs about her, and the bards mostly sang them warily, only in summer at midday. She had been dead and buried 500 years, but that hadn't stopped her turning up in Rosia only 40 years ago at the baptism of the newborn prince. She'd turned 6 guards who tried to stop her into toads, put 2 other wizards to sleep, then she'd gone over to the baby and peered frowning down at him. Then she'd straightened up and announced in irritation, I've fallen out of time, before vanishing in a great cloud of smoke. So being dead wasn't a bar to her sudden return to claim her spellbook back, but the dragon only grew even more annoyed at my expression. Stop looking like a solemn 6-year-old. Contrary to popular imagination, she is dead, and whatever time-wandering she may have done beforehand, I assure you she would have had a larger purpose than to run around eavesdropping on gossip about herself. As for that book, I spent an inordinate amount of money and trouble to get it, and congratulated myself on the acquisition until I realised how infuriatingly incomplete it was. She plainly only used it to jog her memory. It has no details of real spell work. The 4 I've tried have all worked perfectly well, I said, and he stared at me. He didn't believe me until he'd made me throw half a dozen of Yaga's spells. They were all alike. A few words, a few gestures, a few bits of herbs and things. No particular piece mattered. There was no strict order to the incantations. I did see why he called her spells unteachable, because I couldn't even remember what I did when I cast them, much less explain why I did any one step. But for me, they were an inexpressible relief after the stiff, overcomplicated spells he'd set me. My first description held true. I felt as though I was picking my way through a bit of forest that I had never seen before, and her words were like another experienced gleaner somewhere ahead of me, calling back to say, "There are blueberries down on the northern slope," or "good mushrooms by the birches over there," or "there's an easy way through the brambles on the left." She didn't care how I got to the blueberries. She only pointed me in the proper direction and let me wander my way over to them, feeling out the ground beneath my feet. He hated it so very much that I almost felt sorry for him. He finally resorted to standing over me while I cast the final spell, noting down every small thing I did, even the sneeze from breathing in too deep over the cinnamon, and when I was finished, he tried it again himself. It was very strange watching him, like a delayed and flattering mirror. He did everything exactly the way I had done, but more gracefully, with perfect precision, enunciating every syllable I had slurred. But he wasn't halfway through before I could tell it wasn't working. I twitched to interrupt him. He shot me a furious look, so I gave up and let him finish working himself into a thicket, as I thought of it, and when he was done and nothing whatsoever had happened, I said, "You shouldn't have said Miko there." "You did," he snapped. I shrugged helplessly. I didn't doubt that I had, though to be perfectly honest, I didn't remember. But it hadn't been an important thing to remember. "It was all right when I did it," I said, "but when you did it, it was wrong. As though you were following a trail, but a tree had fallen down in the meantime, or some hedge grew up, and you insisted on continuing on anyway instead of going around it." "There are no hedges," he roared. "It comes, I suppose," I said thoughtfully, speaking to the air, "of spending too much time alone indoors and forgetting that living things don't always stay where you put them." He ordered me from the room in stiff fury. I must give him this credit. He sulked for the rest of the week, and then he dug out a small collection of other spell books from his shelves, dusty and unused, full of untidy spells like the one in Yaga's book. They all came to my hands like eager friends. He picked through them and consulted dozens of references in his other books, and with that knowledge laid out a course of study and practice for me. He warned me of all the dangers of higher workings, of the spell slipping out of your hands midway and thrashing around wild, of losing yourself in magic and wandering through it like a dream you could touch while your body died of thirst, of attempting a spell past your limits and having it drain away strength you didn't have. Though he still couldn't understand how the spells that suited me worked at all, he made himself a ferocious critic of my results and demanded that I tell him beforehand what I meant to happen, and when I couldn't properly predict the outcome, he forced me to work that same spell over and over again until I could. In short, he tried to teach me as best he could, and to advise me in my blundering through my new forest, though it was foreign country to him. He did still resent my success, not from jealousy, but as a matter of principle. It offended his sense of the proper order of things that my slapdash workings did work, and he scowled as much when I was doing well as when I had made some evident mistake. A month into my new training, he was glaring at me while I struggled to make an illusion of a flower. "I don't understand," I said, whined, if I tell the truth. It was absurdly difficult. My first 3 attempts had looked like they were made of cotton rags. Now I had managed to put together a tolerably convincing wild rose, as long as you didn't try to smell it. It's far easier just to grow a flower. Why would anyone bother? It's a matter of scale, he said. I assure you it is considerably easier to produce the illusion of an army than the real thing. How is that even working? He burst out, as he sometimes did when pressed past his limits by the obvious dreadfulness of my magic. You aren't maintaining the spell at all. No chanting, no gesture. I'm still giving it magic. A great deal of magic, I added unhappily. The first few spells that didn't yank magic out of me like pulling teeth had been so purely a relief that I had half thought that that was the worst of it over. Now that I understood how magic ought to work, whatever the dragon said on that subject, everything would be easy. Well, I soon learned better. Desperation and terror had fueled my first working, and my next few attempts had been the equivalent of the first cantrips he'd tried to teach me, the little spells he had expected me to master effortlessly. So I had indeed mastered these effortlessly, and then he had unmercifully set me at real spells, and everything had at once again become, if not unbearable in the same way, at least exceedingly difficult. How are you giving it magic? He said through his teeth. I already found the path, I said. I'm just staying on it. Can't you feel it? I asked abruptly, and held my hand cupping the flower out towards him. He frowned and put his hands around it, and then he said, Variarusha ilikadui, and a second illusion laid itself over mine, 2 roses in the same space. His predictably had 3 rings of perfect petals and a delicate fragrance. Try and match it, he said absently, his fingers moving slightly. And by lurching steps, we brought our illusions closer together until it was nearly impossible to tell them one from another. And then he said, suddenly, just as I began to glimpse his spell, almost exactly like that strange clockwork on the middle of the table, all shining, moving parts. On an impulse, I tried to align our workings. I envisioned his like the water wheel of a mill, and mine the rushing stream driving it around. What are you, he began, and then abruptly we had only a single rose, and it began to grow. And not only the rose. Vines were climbing up the bookshelves in every direction, twining themselves around ancient tomes and reaching out the window. The tall, slender columns that made the arch of the doorway were lost among rising birches, spreading out long finger branches. Moss and violets were springing up across the floor, delicate ferns unfurling. Flowers were blooming everywhere, flowers I had never seen, strange blooms dangling and others with sharp points, brilliantly coloured. And the room was thick with their fragrance, with a smell of crushed leaves and pungent herbs. I looked around myself, alight with wonder, my magic still flowing easily. Is this what you meant? I asked him. It really wasn't any more difficult than making the single flower had been. But he was staring at the riot of flowers all around us, as astonished as I was. He looked at me, baffled and for the first time uncertain, as though he had stumbled into something unprepared. His long, narrow hands were cradled around mine, both of us holding the rose together. Magic was singing in me, through me. I felt the murmur of his power singing back that same song. I was abruptly too hot and strangely conscious of myself. I pulled my hands free. Another chapter?
Don't make us beg.
Please, please.
Oh, all right then. Chapter 7. I avoided him all the next day, stupidly, and realised too late that my success in doing so meant he had avoided me too, when he had never let me miss a lesson before. I didn't care to think why. I tried to pretend it meant nothing, that we had both simply wanted a holiday from my laborious training. But I passed a restless night and went down to the library the next morning sandy-eyed and nervous. He didn't look at me as I came in. He said shortly, "Begin with Funkea on page 43. A wholly different spell, and he kept his head bent over his own book. I gladly dived for the safety of my work. We lasted 4 days in near silence, and might have gone a month without exchanging more than a few words a day, I suppose, left to our own devices. But on the morning of the 4th day, a sledge drew up to the tower, and when I looked out the window, it was Boris, but not alone. He was driving Kasha's mother, Vensa, and she was huddled small in the sleigh, her pale round face looking up at me from under her shawl. I hadn't seen anyone from Dvernik since the beacon night. Danka had sent the Fireheart back to Alshanka with an escort gathered grimly from every village of the valley as it passed through with a message. They had come in the force to the tower 4 days after I had transported the dragon and myself back. It was brave of them, farmers and craftsmen, coming to face a worse horror than any of us could even have imagined, and they had been wary of believing that the dragon was healed. The mayor of Alshanka had even had the courage to demand that the dragon show the wound to the town physician. He grudgingly obliged, rolling up his sleeve to show the faint white scar, all that was left of the wound, and even told the man to draw some blood from his fingertip. It sprang out clean red. But they had also brought the old priest in his full purple gown to say a blessing over him, which infuriated him to no end. "What on earth are you lending yourself to this nonsense for?" he demanded of the priest, who he evidently knew a little. "I've let you shrive a dozen corrupted souls. Did any of them sprout the purple rose, or suddenly announce themselves saved and purified? What possible good do you imagine saying a blessing over me would do if I were corrupted?" "So you are well, then," the priest had said dryly, and they had last allowed themselves to believe, and the mayor had handed over the Fireheart with great relief. But of course, my father and brothers hadn't been allowed to come, nor had anyone from my village who would have grieved to see me burn. And the men who had come, they'd looked at me standing beside the dragon, and I didn't know how to name what was in their faces. I was back in comfortable plain skirts again, but they looked at me anyway as they went away, not with hostility, but not the way any of them would ever have looked at a woodcutter's girl from Dvernik. It was the way I had looked at Prince Marek at first. They looked at me and saw someone out of a story, who might ride by and be stared at, but didn't belong in their lives at all. I flinched from those looks. I was glad to go back into the tower. That was the day I had taken Yaga's book down to the library and demanded that the dragon stop pretending I had any more gift for healing than I did for any other sort of spell, and let me learn the kind of magic that I could do. I hadn't tried to write a letter, even though I suppose the dragon would have let me send one. What would I say? I had gone home, and I had even saved it, but it wasn't my place anymore. I couldn't go and dance in the village square among my friends. Any more than 6 months ago, I could have marched into the dragon's library and sat down at his table. When I saw Vensa's face, though, even from the library window, I didn't think of any of that. I left my working hanging in the air, unfinished, as he'd so often ordered me never to do, and flung myself down the stairs. He shouted after me, but his voice couldn't reach me, because Vensa wouldn't be here if Kasha could have come. I jumped down the last few steps into the great hall, and at the doors I halted only a moment. "Irana, Irana!" I cried. It was only a charm for untying snarled knots of threads, and slurred besides, but I flung profligate magic behind it, as though I'd determined to hack my way through a thicket with an axe instead of taking the time to find a way around. The doors jumped as if startled, and opened for me. I fell through them onto suddenly weak knees, as the dragon delighted in telling me caustically there was good reason that the more powerful spells were also the more complicated. But I staggered up and caught Venser's hands as she raised them to knock. Her face, seen close, was wrung with weeping. Her hair was hanging down her back, clouds of it pulling out of the long, thick plait, and her clothing was torn and stained with dirt. She was wearing her night shift and a smock flung over it. "Agnieszka," she said, gripping my hands too hard, strangling the feeling out of them and her nails digging into my skin. "Agnieszka, I had to come." "Tell me," I said. "They took her this morning when she went for water," Venser said. "3 of them. 3 walkers," her voice breaking. It was a bad spring when even one of the walkers came out of the wood and went plucking people out of the forests like fruit. I'd seen one once, a long way off through the trees. Like an enormous twig insect, at once almost impossible to see among the underbrush, and jointed wrong and dreadful, so when it moved I had shuddered back from it, queasy. They had arms and legs like branches, with long, twiggy stalk fingers, and they would pick their way through the woods and find places near footpaths and near water, near clearings, and wait in silence. If someone came in arm's reach, there was no saving them, unless you had a great many men with axes and fire nearby. When I was 12, they caught one half a mile past Zatocek, the tiny village that was the last in the valley, the last before the wood. The walker had taken a child, a little boy, bringing a pail of water to his mother for the washing. She'd seen him snatched and screamed. There had been enough women nearby to raise the alarm and slow it down. They had halted it at last with fire, but it had still been a day's work to hack it into pieces. The walker broke the child's arm and legs where it gripped to it, and never let go until they finally cut through the trunk of its body and severed the limbs. Even then, it took 3 strong men to break the fingers off the boy's body, and he had scars around his arms and legs, patterned like the bark of an oak tree. Those the walkers carried into the wood were less lucky. We didn't know what happened to them, but they came back out sometimes, corrupted in the worst way, smiling and cheerful, unharmed. They seemed almost themselves to anyone who didn't know them well, and you might spend half a day talking with one of them and never realize anything was wrong until you found yourself taking up a knife and cutting off your own hand, putting out your own eyes, your own tongue, while they kept talking all the while, smiling, horrible. And then they would take the knife and go inside your house, to your children, while you lay outside blind and choking and helpless even to scream. If someone we loved was taken by the walkers, the only thing we knew to hope for them was death, and it could only be a hope. We could never know for certain until one of them came out and proved they weren't dead, and then had to be hunted down. "Not Kasia," I said. "Not Kasia." Venser had bent her head. She was weeping into my hands, which she still clenched on like iron. "Please, Agnieszka, please." She spoke hoarsely, without hope. She would never have come to ask the dragon for help, I knew. She would have known better. But she had come to me. She couldn't stop weeping. I brought her inside into the small entry hall, and the dragon impatiently stalked into the room and held her out a draught, though she shrank from him and hid her face until I gave it to her. She relaxed heavily almost as soon as she had drunk it, and her face smoothed. She let me help her upstairs to my own little room, and she lay down on the bed quietly, though with her eyes open. The dragon stood in the doorway watching us. I held up the locket from around Venser's neck. "She has a lock of Kasia's hair." I knew she'd cut it from Kasia's head the night before the choosing, thinking she would have nothing left to remember her daughter by. "If I use Loitalal..." He shook his head. What do you imagine you're going to find beside a smiling corpse? The girl is gone. He jerked his chin at Venser, whose eyes had drifted shut. She'll be calmer after she sleeps. Tell that driver to come back in the morning to take her home. He turned and left, and the worst of it was how matter-of-factly he'd spoken. He hadn't snapped at me or called me a fool. He hadn't said the life of a village girl wasn't worth the chance the wood might add me to its host. He hadn't told me I was an idiot, drunk on success in throwing potions, in pulling flowers from the air, to suddenly think I could save someone the wood had taken. The girl is gone. He'd even sounded sorry in his abrupt way. I sat with Venser, numb and cold, holding her hard, red, calloused hand in my lap. It was growing dark outside. If Kasia was still alive, if she was in the wood watching the sun go down, light dying through the leaves, how long did it take to hollow someone out from the inside? I thought of Kasia in the grip of the walkers, the long fingers curled around her arms and legs, knowing all the while what was happening, what would happen to her. I left Venser sleeping and went downstairs to the library. The dragon was there, looking through one of the vast ledgers he made records in. I stood in the doorway, staring at his back. "I know you hold her dear," he said over his shoulder, "but there's no kindness in offering false hope." I didn't say anything. Yager's book of spells was lying open on the table, small and worn. I'd been studying only spells of earth this week, Fulmkea, Fulmedesh, Fulmishta, solid and fixed, as far from the air and fire of illusion as magic could get. I took the book and slipped it into my pocket behind the dragon's back, and then I turned around and went silently down the stairs. Boris was still outside, waiting, his face long and bleak. He looked up from his blanketed horses when I came out of the tower. "Will you drive me to the wood?" I asked him. He nodded, and I climbed into his sleigh and drew the blankets around me as he made the horses ready again. He climbed aboard and spoke to them, jingling his reins, and the sleigh leapt out over the snow. The moon was high that night, full and beautiful, blue light on the shining snow all around. I opened Yager's book as we flew and found a spell for the quickening of feet. I sang it softly to the horses, their ears pricking back to listen to me, and the wind of our passage grew muffled and thick, pressing hard on my cheeks and blurring my sight. The spindle, frozen over, was a pale silver road running alongside, and a shadow grew in the east ahead of us, grew and grew until the horses, uneasy, slowed and came to a halt without any word or any movement of rain. The world stopped moving. We were stopped under a small, ragged cluster of pine trees. The wood stood ahead of us across an open stretch of unbroken snow. Once a year, when the ground thawed, the dragon took all the unmarried men older than 15 out to the borders of the wood. He burned a swathe of ground along its edge, bare and black, and the men followed his fire, sprinkling the ground with salt so nothing could grow or take root. In all our villages, we saw the plumes of smoke rising. We saw them going up also on the other side of the wood, far away in Rosia, and knew they were doing the same. But the fires always died when they reached the shadow beneath the dark trees. I climbed down from the sleigh. Boris looked at me, his face tense and afraid. But he said, "I'll wait," although I knew he couldn't. Wait how long? For what? Wait here in the wood's very shadow? I thought of my own father, waiting for Marta if our places had been changed. I shook my head. If I could bring Kasia out, I thought I could get her to the tower. I hoped the dragon's spell would let us in. "Go home," I said. And then I asked him, wanting suddenly to know, "Is Marta well?" He nodded slightly. "She's married. he said, and then he hesitated and said, "There's a child coming." I remembered her at the choosing 5 months ago. Her red dress, her beautiful black braids, her narrow, pale, frightened face. It didn't seem possible we'd ever stood next to each other, just the same. Her and me and Kasia in a row. It took my breath, hard and painful, to imagine her sitting at her own hearth, already a young matron, getting ready for childbed. "I'm glad," I said with an effort, refusing to let my mouth close up with jealousy. It wasn't that I wanted a husband and a baby. I didn't. Or rather, I only wanted them in the way I wanted to live to 100. Someday, far off, never thinking about the particulars. But they meant life. She was living, and I wasn't. Even if I came somehow out of the wood alive again, I'd never have what she had. And Kasia might already be dead. But I wouldn't go into the wood with ill wishing. I took a deep, hard breath and made myself say, "I wish her an easy birth and a healthy child." I even managed to mean it. Childbirth was frightening enough, even if it was a more familiar terror. "Thank you," I added, and turned away to cross over the barren ground to the wall of great dark trunks. I heard the jingle of the harness behind me as Boris turned the horses and trotted away, but the sound was muffled and soon faded. I didn't look around, taking step after step until I stopped just beneath the first boughs. A little snow was falling, soft and quiet. Vencer's locket was cold in my hand as I opened it. Yaga had 6 different finding spells, small and easy. It seemed she'd had a habit of misplacing things. "Loy talal," I said softly to the small coiled braid of Kasia's hair. "Good for finding the whole from apart," the scribbled note on the spell had said. My breath fogged into a small pale cloud and drifted away from me, leading the way into the trees. I stepped between 2 trunks and followed it inside the wood. I expected it to be more dreadful than it was. But at first it seemed only an old, old forest. The trees were great pillars in a dark, endless hall, well apart from one another. Their twisting, gnarled roots blanketed in dark green moss, small feathery ferns curled up close to the night. Tall, pale mushrooms grew in hosts like toy soldiers marching. The snow hadn't reached the ground beneath the trees, not even now in the deep of winter. A thin layer of frost clung to the leaves and fine branches. I heard an owl calling somewhere distantly as I picked my way carefully through the trees. The moon was still above, clear white light coming through the bare branches. I followed my own faint breath and imagined myself a small mouse hiding from owls, a small mouse hunting for a piece of corn, a hidden nut. When I went gleaning in the forest, I often daydreamed as I walked. I lost myself in the cool, shady green, in the songs of birds and frogs, in the running gurgle of a stream over rocks. I tried to lose myself the same way now, tried to be only another part of the forest, nothing worthy of attention. But there was something watching. I felt it more and more with every step the deeper I went into the wood, a weight laid heavily across my shoulders like an iron yoke. I had come inside, half expecting corpses hanging from every bough, wolves leaping at me from the shadows. Soon I was wishing for wolves. There was something worse here. The thing I had glimpsed looking out of Yerzi's eyes was here, something alive, and I was trapped inside an airless room with it, pressed into a small corner. There was a song in this forest too, but it was a savage song, whispering of madness and tearing and rage. I crept on, my shoulders hunched, trying to be small. Then I came stumbling to a small stream, barely a rivulet, frost thick on both banks and black water running between them, the moonlight coming through the break in the trees. And there was a walker on the other side, its strange, narrow stick head bent to the water to drink, its mouth like a crack open in its face. It lifted its head and looked straight at me, dripping. Its eyes were knots in wood, round, dark, pouched holes that some small animal might have lived in. There was a scrap of green woolen cloth dangling from one of its legs, caught on a jutting spar at the joint. We stared at each other across the narrow running thread of the river. Fulmedesh, I said, my voice shaking, and a crack in the ground opened beneath the walker and swallowed up its back legs. It scrabbled at the bank with the rest of its long stick limbs, thrashing silently, throwing up sprays of water, but the earth had closed up around the middle of its body and it couldn't pull itself out. But I folded in on myself and swallowed a cry of pain. It felt like someone had hit me with a stick across the shoulders. The wood had felt my working. I was sure of it. The wood was looking for me now. It was looking, and soon it would find me. I had to force myself to move. I sprang over the stream and ran after my faint cloudy spell, which still drifted on ahead of me. The walker tried to catch at me with its long, cracked wood fingers. I skirted around it, but I ran past. I came through a ring of larger trunks and found myself in an open space around a smaller tree, the ground here heavy with snow. There was a fallen tree stretching across the space, a giant, its trunk taller across than I was. Its fall had opened up this clearing, and in the middle of it, a new tree had sprung up to take its place. But not the same kind of tree. All the other trees I'd seen in the wood had been familiar kinds, despite their stained bark and the twisted, unnatural angles of their branches. Oaks and black birch and tall pines. But this was no kind of tree I had ever seen. It was already larger around than the circle my arms could make, even though the giant tree couldn't have fallen very long ago. It had smooth grey bark over a strangely knotted trunk, with long branches in even circles around it, starting high up the trunk like a larch. Its branches weren't bare with winter, but carried a host of dried up silvery leaves that rustled in the wind, a noise that seemed to come from somewhere else, as though there were people just out of sight, speaking softly together. The trail of my breath had dissolved into the air. Looking down at the deep snow, I could see the marks where the walker's legs had poked through and the lines their bellies had drawn, all going to the tree. I took a wary step through the snow towards it, and then another, and then I stopped. Kasia was bound to the tree. Her back was against the trunk and her arms drawn backward around it. I hadn't seen her at first, because the bark had already grown over her. Her face was turned up a little, and beneath the skim of the covering bark I could see her mouth had been open, screaming while the bark closed over her. I made a choked cry helplessly and staggered forward and put out my hands to touch her. The bark was hard beneath my fingers already, the grey skin smooth and hard, as though she had been swallowed into the trunk whole, all of her made a part of the tree, of the wood. I couldn't get a hold on the bark, though I tried frantically to claw and peel it away. But I managed at last to scrape off a little thin piece over her cheek, and beneath it I found her own soft skin, still warm, still alive. But even as I touched it with my fingertip, the bark crept quickly over it, and I had to draw back my hand not to be caught myself. I covered my mouth with my hands, even more desperate. I still knew so little. No spell came to my mind, nothing that could get Kasia out, nothing that would even put an axe in my hands, a knife, even if there had been time to carve her free. The wood knew I was here. Even now its creatures were moving towards me, stealthy, padding feet through the forest, walkers and wolves and worse things still. I suddenly was sure that there were things that never left the wood at all, things so dreadful no one had ever seen them. And they were coming. With bare feet in the dirt, Fulmia, 10 times with conviction, will shake the earth to its roots if you had the strength, Yaga's book had told me, and the dragon had believed it enough not to let me try it anywhere near the tower. I had felt doubtful anyway about conviction. I hadn't believed I had any business shaking the earth to its roots. But now I fell to the ground and dug away the snow and the fallen leaves and rot and moss until I came to the hard frozen dirt. I pried up a large stone and began to smash at the earth again and again, breaking up the dirt and breathing on it to make it softer, pounding in the snow that melted around my hands, pounding in the hot tears that dripped from my eyes as I worked. Kasia was above me with her head flung up, her mouth open in its soundless cry like a statue in a church. Fulmia, I said, my fingers deep in the dirt, crushing the solid clods between my fingers. Fulmia, Fulmia, I chanted over and over, bleeding from broken nails, and I felt the earth hear me, uneasily. Even the earth was tainted here, poisoned, but I spat on the dirt and screamed, Fulmia, and imagined my magic running into the ground like water, finding cracks and weaknesses, spreading out beneath my hands, beneath my cold, wet knees. And the earth shuddered and turned over. A low trembling began where my hands drove into the ground, and it followed me as I started prying at the roots of the tree. The frozen dirt began to break up into small chunks all around them, the tremors going on and on like waves. The branches above me were waving wildly as if in alarm, the whispering of the leaves becoming a muted roaring. I straightened up on my knees. Let her out, I screamed at the tree. I beat on its trunk with my muddy fists. Let her out or I'll bring you down. Fulmia, I cried out in rage and threw myself back down on the ground. And where my fists hit, the ground rose and swelled like a river rising with the rain. Magic was pouring out of me, a torrent. Every warning the dragon had ever given me forgotten and ignored. I would have spent every drop of myself and died there just to bring that horrible tree down. I couldn't imagine a world where I lived, where I left this behind me, Kasia's life and heart feeding this corrupt, monstrous thing. I would rather have died, crushed in my own earthquake, and brought it down with me. I tore at the ground, ready to break open a pit to swallow us all. And then, with a sound like ice breaking in the spring, the bark cracked open, running up and down the length of Kasia's body. I lunged up from the dirt at once and dug my fingers into the crack, prying the sides wide and reaching in for her. I caught her wrist, her arm limp and heavy, and pulled. She fell out of the horrible dark gap, bending at the waist like a rag doll, and I backed away, dragging her dead weight free into the snow, both my hands wrapped around her wrist. Her skin was fish pale, sickly, like all the sun had been drunk out of her. Sap smelling like spring rain ran over her in thin green rivulets, and she didn't move. I fell to my knees beside her. Kasia, I said, sobbing. Kasia! The bark had already closed itself up like a seam around the hole where she had been. I caught Kasia's hands in my wet, dirty ones and pressed them to my cheeks, to my lips. They were cold, but not as cold as my own. There was a trace of life in them. I bent down and heaved her onto my shoulders.
Oh, it's so exciting. Oh my god.
Holy fuck.
This book is so good.
Yeah.
So
So
badass,
visual as
yeah.
well. I can just see everything you're saying. It's just amazing.
Yeah. It's really good for getting the visuals. Amazing.
Yeah, I was thinking that it would make for a very cool, creepy movie.
I think they're making a movie of it according to the Wikipedia page.
Really?
Ooh.
It's so creepy.
Oh.
So creepy. Oh my god.
Mm-hmm.
Right, hold on, get it.
Who would you have direct the movie then? It'd be easy to mess up, I think.
Yeah, Del Toro would do a good job, eh?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
I like that when you said we're going to enjoy this, the first one was like the first chapter was kind of fun, and there was lots of funny bits between herself and the dragon, and lots of descriptions of food, which was nice as I was chopping my vegetables, and also descriptions of pus coming out, which was nice when I was chopping my vegetables. Jesus, the second chapter, it was terrible. When Cassia was in trouble, it was like, oh no, this has just gone Game of Thrones, and I don't know if I can cope. Oh.
It was the right roller coaster. I loved it. Also,
made me realise
this
why.
is how I think a walker looks like.
Oh, yes.
Oh, that's.
I like the face.
Yeah, very cool. Hold on, keep holding it up while I spotlight it for a second. Yeah, badass.
Looks really
Amazing.
cool.
I think you need to give it an open mouth. Like, I know they said the mouth was like a crack, but I imagined it like a gaping hole. I could be totally wrong.
Awesome. So cool.
I don't know. I feel like it looks a bit funnier than the description.
It's not quite evil enough.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know how
Also,
to go that level of evil. Maybe it's just not possible.
Maybe you're just not evil enough.
Did anybody else find themselves really giggling about how mad the dragon gets?
Yeah, I love that.
Yes.
And I love that.
I'm amused by how he gets mad about things he doesn't understand.
Yeah.
It's really cute.
Yeah, and she's just like, well.
He sort of fudges it and then just doesn't talk about his mistakes.
Yeah.
It's like, I just sort of magicked. What? Is that different for you? No.
You remind me of so many teachers I had. Bad one.
To be fair, like I can definitely kind of see his point of view. You know, like when someone can do something or is able to do something, and you're like, how did you like teach me how to do that? How did you like show me that? And then you're like, oh, I don't know, I just did it. You just do it, and that's how you do it. Like, oh, that's so.
But is that because you've read ahead of what we've done today?
Oh no, that's just me being
Okay.
unbearable and dragonish.
I've found it a bit awkward because I had to keep on looking. I've got so into it.
Oh, have you read ahead?
Yes.
Oh,
No spoilers.
no spoilers.
There's so many different things happening. It's just I couldn't let go.
So I'm muting. Van, I'll mute you. Don't think I won't.
Can I discuss some theories?
Oh my god, please do.
Okay, so.
Can I keep recording, or do you want me to stop recording?
Oh, you can stop recording so that I can't be proved wrong later.
Okay. Hello, catch-up crew. Come join us live. I hope you enjoyed it.